Claire don't expect a single dollar from Grandpa's will. The words landed like a gavel on the polished dining table, sharp and final. My father, Richard Whitmore, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His certainty had always been enough to flatten any protest. I sat rigidly in one of the high-backed mahogany chairs, my hands pressed flat on my thighs under the table to keep them from shaking. The crystal chandelier overhead threw cold light onto the silver and china that hadn't yet been cleared from the post-funeral meal, a bitter reminder of what we'd just buried. I kept my eyes on the cream-colored envelope resting beside my plate. The invitation to the will reading still felt impossibly heavy for its size. Bennett and Associates, it read in raised black ink, and beneath my name spelled out in letters too formal to mistake. I tightened my grip on it, a small act of defiance my parents didn't even notice. Across from me, Vanessa leaned back in her chair with the practiced ease of someone born to own a room. She had changed from her funeral black dress into a tailored sweater and slacks, but even in muted colors she gleamed. "It's not personal, Claire," she said, twirling the stem of her wine glass. "You've never been interested in the business. Grandpa groomed me for Whitmore Holdings for years. Everyone knows it." Everyone. The word scraped something raw inside me. I remembered sitting on the porch of Gregory's cabin last year as he'd shown me how to read a balance sheet, his warm hands guiding mine over the columns of figures. He'd never told anyone about those quiet lessons, and I had never thought to brag. Those afternoons weren't about proving anything. They had felt like belonging. Vanessa is right. My mother Evelyn added her tone as smooth and cold as the marble countertops in the kitchen. She adjusted the sleeve of her cashmere sweater and wouldn't meet my eyes. "It would be better for everyone if you didn't set yourself up for disappointment. The board is already making arrangements for Vanessa's transition to CEO. It's what your grandfather would have wanted." I let the silence stretch. It was a trick I'd learned in this house. If I spoke too soon, they'd interpret it as weakness. If I stayed quiet long enough, they might actually hear me. My father mistook my pause for agreement and rose from the table, brushing non-existent lint from his suit jacket. "Let's not make a scene," he said. Vanessa tilted her head, studying me like a cat, might a mouse that had forgotten its place. "You're not even comfortable in this house anymore," she said softly, almost kindly. "Why put yourself through it? Tomorrow will only hurt." Hurt. The word lingered in the heavy air. I thought of the small wooden box wrapped in a wool scarf at the bottom of my suitcase upstairs. Gregory had pressed it into my hands last winter, his eyes steady and serious. "Not yet," he'd murmured. "One day you'll know why." I hadn't opened it. Maybe I was afraid of what it would confirm or deny. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood. Vanessa's expression flickered, a hairline crack in her perfect mask. My mother finally looked up, her brow drawn tight. "Claire?" she began, but I cut her off. "I'll be there," I said. The room went still, as though the house itself was holding its breath. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Vanessa's lips parted as if to reply, then closed again. I picked up the envelope, slid it into my coat pocket, and left the table without another word. The corridors of the Whitmore estate were dim, the sconces casting thin pools of light along the walls lined with ancestral portraits. Their painted eyes followed me as I climbed the back staircase, the one the staff used to avoid disturbing the family. It smelled faintly of polish and old wood, a scent that carried me back to childhood nights when I'd crept to Gregory's study just to be near someone who saw me. In my bedroom, the air was colder than the rest of the house. I dropped my coat on the antique armchair and placed the envelope carefully on the desk beside the brass letter opener Gregory had given me years ago. Its weight felt steady in my hand, like a promise. I knelt by the suitcase and lifted out the wooden box still wrapped in the scarf. My fingers itched to open it, but I resisted. Not yet. Whatever was inside, I wanted to face it on my terms. I tucked it back into its hiding place and stood hugging my arms around myself. Through the window, the Connecticut night pressed close, black and silent. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes spinning in the porch light below. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the hour, each chime marking the distance between who my family believed I was and who Gregory had known me to be. I crossed the room, switched off the lamp, and let the darkness settle. The envelope lay on the desk, its embossed seal catching the faint glow from the street lamp outside. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of it anchoring me in place. I didn't feel like an heir. I felt like an intruder in my own bloodline. But tomorrow, I would walk into that room, and they would see me whether they wanted to or not. Claire returned to her room, placed the invitation letter on the table, and thought alone in the darkness. Grandpa groomed me to lead Whitmore Holdings. Vanessa's voice floated from the stage with a confidence that filled the sleek glass-walled press room. Reporters leaned forward with pens poised, camera shutters clicking as if the rhythm belonged to her. She stood behind the polished oak lectern beneath the Whitmore Holdings crest, framed by towering banners that bore the company's name. Every detail, from the perfectly tailored charcoal dress to the modest smile she wore for the cameras, reinforced the story she wanted the world to believe: Vanessa Whitmore was the future. I lingered near the back of the room, pressed close to the wall. The rows of chairs were packed with journalists, corporate partners, and employees who'd managed to secure a seat for the announcement. A few recognized me. Their glances slid past with polite curiosity before they settled on Vanessa again. I was background noise here, as invisible as the security cameras blinking quietly in the corners. Your grandfather believed in building legacy. Vanessa continued, pausing to allow the murmur of agreement to swell. He entrusted me with the tools, the knowledge, and the vision necessary to guide Whitmore Holdings into the next era. I intend to honor that trust. Her words struck a familiar chord. I could almost hear Gregory's voice from another lifetime, quiet and deliberate. True strength isn't loud, Claire. It's steady. He had said it once while teaching me to drive a nail into the old cabin porch, my hands clumsy with the hammer. Vanessa's version of strength was loud and bright. Gregory's had been something else entirely. The CEO of Communications opened the floor to questions. Hands shot up, and Vanessa fielded each one with a fluency that bordered on rehearsed. Someone asked about the company's short-term strategy. Another inquired about her leadership style. She answered as if she had already been named head of the empire. Behind me, two junior analysts whispered, unbothered by the fact that I could hear. "She's a natural," one said. "Yeah," the other replied. "Unlike her sister." "What's she even doing here?" Heat crawled up my neck, but I didn't turn. The truth was, I wasn't sure why I had come. Maybe to remind myself of what was at stake, or to remember why I couldn't let them erase me so easily. Vanessa spotted me then. Her gaze skimmed the crowd and landed on mine, and a flicker of satisfaction crossed her face, subtle as a blade. As we moved forward, she told the audience it's important to stay unified. Whitmore Holdings has always been a family company. That spirit will remain. Richard and Evelyn stood at the edge of the stage, smiling like proud parents at a recital. They clapped at all the right moments, nodding when reporters praised Vanessa's poise. My father's eyes brushed over me once without recognition. My mother didn't look at me at all. The press conference ended with a burst of applause, the kind that seemed to carry Vanessa off the stage like a tide. Reporters swarmed around her, thrusting microphones forward. I tried to slip out unnoticed, but a group of employees gathered near the coffee table, blocking the exit. "She's flawless," one of them gushed, holding a phone, already scrolling through the morning's coverage. "The board must be thrilled." "Of course they are," someone else replied. "Vanessa is the brand. Claire, she's just a shadow." The words landed heavier than I expected, but I forced my face blank. I had learned long ago that showing pain only gave them more power. "Miss Whitmore?" I turned to find Eleanor Chase standing a few feet away. She was one of the longest-serving members of the board, her silver hair swept neatly back, her navy suit immaculate. She wasn't smiling, but there was no malice in her expression either, only a keen interest I couldn't quite read. "I'm glad you attended," she said quietly, as if testing the ground. "Thank you," I murmured. Her gaze lingered on me for another moment before she nodded once and moved on her heels, clicking against the marble floor. I watched her disappear into the crowd, unsure why her acknowledgement mattered. A ripple of laughter rose from the knot of reporters surrounding Vanessa. She broke away from them at last, striding toward me with the ease of someone who had already won. She stopped close enough that I could see the faint shimmer of powder on her cheekbones. "You really don't belong here, do you?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a statement dressed as kindness, a reminder of my place. I held her gaze for a long second, searching for something, hesitation, doubt. Anything but Vanessa's confidence was unshakable. Without a word, I stepped aside, the envelope from Bennett and Associates, a heavy weight in my coat pocket. Claire looked at Vanessa, gave no response, and quietly walked away, leaving Eleanor even more curious. Of the heavy cream-colored paper was the first sound in the study, louder than it should have been. My father's hand hovered over the mahogany desk for a beat. The document balanced between his fingers like a verdict waiting to fall. He set it down in front of me and slid a fountain pen alongside it with mechanical precision. The Whitmore study always felt smaller at night, the dark wood walls pressing in under the weight of decades of family portraits. A single lamp burned on the desk, its light pooling in a soft circle that made my father's expression seem sharper. His jaw clenched in its usual line of control. Evelyn, my mother, stood behind him, arms crossed in her ivory cashmere wrap, as though she were cold. I stared at the paper. Its language was as neat and formal as the embossed company crest at the top, waiver of beneficiary rights. The phrases blurred for a moment before my eyes focused again. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the cabin last winter, the smell of pine and wood smoke, his warm hand closing over mine as he passed me the small wooden box. "One day you'll know why I kept this," he'd said. That box now rested in the bottom of my suitcase upstairs, unopened, but suddenly heavier in my memory. "This isn't what you think," Richard said. His tone was calm, the kind of calm that brooked no disagreement. "It's not about you. It's about preventing chaos. If you sign, we can avoid months, years of unnecessary litigation. It will save you embarrassment and us considerable trouble." Evelyn stepped forward. "We've all been through enough," she added, her voice wrapped in ice. "This is for the peace of the family, Claire. It's not a time to be difficult." Peace. I nearly laughed at the word. There had never been peace in this house, only hierarchy. Vanessa had shown. I had been asked silently and relentlessly to make myself smaller. My fingers hovered above the pen. For a flicker of a moment, I considered what it would feel like to surrender, to let the paper erase me and step quietly out of their world. My life would be simpler. I could leave this house, this family, and never look back. But the memory of Gregory's hand on mine, the weight of the wooden box, and the invitation from Bennett and Associates, still folded in my coat pocket, they all pulled me back. This wasn't just about money. It was about refusing to vanish. "I don't want to fight," I said carefully. "Then don't," Richard replied. He tapped the document once, a subtle command. I looked at my mother. She was watching me as though I were a problem she had already solved. "You've always been so stubborn," she said softly, shaking her head. "Don't turn this into a spectacle. Sign it and you can be free of all of this." Free. Another word they twisted. I picked up the paper, my pulse hammering in my ears, and read it again. Every clause reduced me to an afterthought. With a steady breath, I gripped the page at the top and bottom and tore it cleanly down the middle. The sound split the room like a shout. Then I tore it again, the pieces fluttering to the desk like pale leaves. "I'm not signing away my existence," I said. Richard's face hardened, the mask of composure cracking just enough for me to see the fury beneath. Evelyn's mouth opened in shock, but no words came. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. I placed the shredded pieces on the blotter in front of him, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "You'll regret this, Claire. By the end of next week, Whitmore Holdings will be mine." Vanessa's laugh was low and sharp, slipping through the narrow crack of the heavy oak door as I paused in the hallway. The boardroom at Whitmore Holdings was meant to be soundproof, but even soundproofing couldn't mask her confidence. I froze, pressing myself back against the cool marble wall of the corridor. Through the glass panels, I saw the silhouettes of my family and the board members gathered around the long, polished table. The blinds had been drawn, halfway shadows stretching like bars across the carpet. Vanessa sat at the head of the table, poised and radiant, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, as if the seat had always belonged to her. "Richard," my father leaned forward, his voice measured. "The board must understand this is the logical transition. Gregory is gone, and Vanessa has been prepared for this role since she was young. We need to avoid instability." "She's the obvious choice," Evelyn added from his side. My mother's tone was laced with that practiced certainty that always made people nod along. "We can't allow Claire's indecision or her lack of aptitude to jeopardize what Gregory built." My stomach tightened at the mention of my name. Lack of aptitude. I wanted to storm through the door and confront them, but the instinct to remain unseen held me in place. My breath was shallow as I stepped closer, just enough to hear without being caught. Vanessa's voice rang out again, confident and charming. "We should move the vote up. Next week is perfect. There's no reason to wait until after the will reading. Claire is not a threat. She won't even show up." One of the board members, a man I vaguely recognized from old holiday galas, cleared his throat. "Wouldn't it be prudent to wait until the estate matters are settled?" Vanessa's smile was audible even through the door. "Delays create uncertainty, and uncertainty affects the market. My leadership will reassure investors." Besides, she let the word hang for effect. "Claire isn't suited to this environment. You've all seen it. She lacks the drive, the presence. Gregory may have loved her, but love isn't the same as leadership." A murmur of agreement spread around the table. My nails dug into my palm as I listened. Eleanor Chase's voice finally cut through, low and measured. "The board must consider all perspectives. Gregory valued stability, yes, but he also valued fairness." There was a beat of silence. Vanessa responded smoothly. "Of course, Eleanor, but we can't confuse sentiment with strategy. Claire won't contest this. She's a quiet soul. She won't dare." The room filled with polite laughter. I saw Eleanor's expression shift ever so slightly, her gaze sharpening on Vanessa before she looked down at her notes. Richard moved the conversation along. "Then it's settled. We'll call for a vote next Friday. By then the company will have a clear path forward with Vanessa as CEO." I couldn't listen any longer. The words were acid in my ears, each one another stone laid on the path they were paving without me. As I stepped back from the door, my shoulder brushed the ornate molding, and I caught my reflection in the darkened glass. My eyes were colder than I remembered. I pressed a hand against my coat pocket, feeling the solid outline of the small wooden box Gregory had given me, the one I hadn't dared open. The voices inside the boardroom faded into a dull hum, but Vanessa's last words remained sharp, echoing through the hallway like a promise meant to crush me. "Claire won't even dare to show up at the reading." Claire stood outside the door, hearing every word, her hand clenched tightly around the wooden box. "Are you ready for what's coming?" Claire Charles Bennett's voice was soft but deliberate, the kind of tone that slipped past defenses and lodged in your chest. He stood just inside the doorway of his corner office at Bennett and Associates, one hand still resting on the polished brass handle as though he might close the door on me at any second. The man carried his authority quietly like Gregory had, which made it all the more powerful. I stepped further into the office, my coat trailing melting flakes of snow onto the Persian rug. The room was warm and faintly scented of cedar from the built-in bookshelves that lined the walls. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface perfectly ordered stacks of files, lined up with military precision. One of those files, Gregory's estate, my grandfather's entire legacy, sat at the center, its manila edges smoothed from handling. "I don't know," I admitted. My voice was steadier than I felt. I need to understand. They've already decided I don't belong. I need to know if this will reading is even real, or if I'm walking into a trap." Charles moved behind his desk and gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite. He had the air of someone who'd weathered decades of family dramas far uglier than mine. "The will is very real," he said, lowering himself into his chair. "And it is legally binding." Gregory was meticulous. He left no room for contestation on the grounds of competency or coercion. "But you know your family, they will not take any of it quietly." "I'm aware," I said, though the words tasted bitter. Charles studied me for a long moment, his gray eyes scanning my face. "Gregory had faith in you, Claire. I would not have called you here if he didn't." I thought of the small wooden box at the bottom of my suitcase. Last night, after the meeting at the boardroom door, I had opened it for the first time. Inside, carefully folded, was a list of names in Gregory's looping handwriting, people he trusted on the board, allies he believed could guide me. The paper had felt impossibly fragile, as if it might disintegrate in my hands, but it gave me a sliver of direction I had lacked. I reached into my bag and withdrew a folder. "He left me this," I said, placing it gently on Charles's desk. "It's a list of people he trusted. Notes about company strategies. Letters. I don't know what's relevant, but he wanted me to have it." Charles opened the folder and skimmed the pages without expression. When he was finished, he closed it and tapped the top lightly. "This will help," he said. "But you need to be prepared for a fight. Richard and Evelyn are already maneuvering, and Vanessa is relentless." I finished for him. "Yes." He leaned forward. "Tomorrow you will walk into that room and they will look for weakness. Do not give them any. You are Gregory Whitmore's granddaughter. He believed in your steadiness when others dismissed you." The words struck a chord, echoing something Gregory had told me once. "True strength isn't loud, Claire. It's steady." "I'm not sure I can be that person," I admitted, my voice dropping. Charles shook his head slowly. "You already are. Gregory didn't choose you out of sentimentality. He chose you because you see people as they are, not as they pretend to be. That will matter when everything else is stripped away." The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside the window, snowflakes swirled in the fading light, blurring the city skyline. I felt the weight of the envelope in my coat pocket heavier than ever. Charles pushed the folder back toward me, his expression unreadable. "Keep this close. And remember." He paused just long enough for the silence to press in. "Tomorrow will change everything, Claire." I rose slowly, tucking the folder back into my bag. My heart pounded with a mix of dread and determination. Charles walked me to the door, his hand firm on my shoulder for a brief moment, a gesture that felt almost paternal. The air outside was bitter, and sharp snow falling in thick wind-driven sheets that coated the city streets in white. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped onto the slick sidewalk, the world muffled around me. Streetlights cast halos through the storm, the glow catching in my hair and lashes. I forced myself to breathe deeply, to remember why I had come this far. Gregory's faith in me, the wooden box, the list of names, all of it anchored me against the storm that was coming. As I started down the block, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. Across the street, half hidden by the swirling snow, stood Eleanor Chase. She wasn't bundled like a woman merely passing by. She was still, her eyes fixed on me. For a fraction of a second, our gazes met, and I saw something there. Curiosity, maybe even calculation. I didn't stop. The snow was too heavy to read her expression clearly, and I couldn't afford to be distracted now. But the knowledge that she had been watching lingered like a spark in the cold. Claire stepped out into the street, the snow falling harder now, her eyes blazing with determination, as Eleanor watched from a distance. Tomorrow, Claire will finally know her place nowhere. Vanessa's voice carried from the grand salon like a dagger wrapped in silk. I was at the landing of the staircase, the mahogany banister cold beneath my fingertips when the words drifted upward. I stopped heart-thudding and leaned slightly over the rail. She stood before the roaring fireplace, the golden light sharpening the angles of her face, her hands gesturing as if she were already on a stage. Richard and Evelyn sat together on the velvet sofa, expressions full of smug pride. Everything is set. Vanessa continued, her tone brimming with self-assurance. The board trusts me. Charles Bennett can't change what Grandpa wanted. By the end of tomorrow, my leadership will be official. It will be better for the company this way, Richard said, swirling the amber in his glass. No uncertainty. The market reacts to confidence, and you, Vanessa, are the very definition of that. Evelyn touched Vanessa's arm, her smile brittle. And Claire will finally be spared the embarrassment. She was never meant for this life. It's better she accepts it. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned quietly and climbed the remaining steps to my room. Every footfall felt heavier than the last, though my face was cool, unreadable. I could almost hear Gregory whispering in my ear as I reached for the door handle. Never underestimate silence. It's the best defense. Inside the room was dim, and still the scent of cedar faint from the closet. I knelt by my suitcase and pulled out the wooden box, the same one Gregory had handed me with his steady gaze months ago. On the desk, I spread the documents. It contained the list of trusted board members' notes on strategy, the letter Gregory had addressed to me, but not yet opened. I traced his familiar handwriting on the envelope, then tucked it carefully into my coat pocket. My phone vibrated. A text from Charles Bennett blinked on the screen. All arrangements are in place. Be ready by 10 a.m. I typed a brief response and set the phone down, but it buzzed again almost instantly. This time the message was from an unknown number. I'll be at the reading. Watch the board members carefully. Eleanor Chase. I stared at the message for a long moment, weighing what it meant. Eleanor had been distant but observant at every encounter. If she was signaling to me now, it was deliberate. A silent alliance, perhaps. The knock at my door startled me. I gathered the documents quickly and slipped them back into the box. Come in, I called. Vanessa swept into the room without waiting for permission, the hem of her silk blouse whispering against the hardwood floor. Packing already, she asked, her gaze sweeping over the open suitcase. No, I said evenly. Preparing. She laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Preparing for disappointment. That's wise. After tomorrow, you'll never set foot in this house again. We'll make sure of it. I stood squaring my shoulders so we were eye to eye. For a beat, neither of us spoke. The firelight from the hall behind her flickered across her face, casting shadows over her flawless features. Claire looked directly at Vanessa, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. We'll see. Claire walked into the will reading room, every eye seeming to measure her. The air in the large conference room of Bennett and Associates was thick, humming with whispers, and the soft rustle of papers as people shifted in their seats. The gleaming mahogany table stretched like a boundary line, and behind it sat the members of the Whitmore Holdings Board, split in quiet factions. Some looked away when I entered, their faces carefully blank, while others tilted their heads as if observing something inevitable. I kept my head high, though the weight of their scrutiny felt like stone. Charles Bennett's words from the day before looped through my mind like a mantra. Tomorrow will change everything. Vanessa was impossible to miss. She occupied the front row with a kind of casual dominance, her black blazer draped over her shoulders like a cape. Richard and Evelyn flanked her, expressions of quiet satisfaction already fixed in place. The three of them resembled royalty holding court, their posture declaring that the outcome had already been decided. A junior associate guided me to a seat at the very back, as far from the head table as possible. I didn't argue. There was a certain freedom in the margins. As I sat, I caught Eleanor Chase's gaze across the room. She was perched near the board's center, her composed face revealing nothing but. When our eyes met, she inclined her head almost imperceptibly. It was the closest thing to reassurance I had received all morning. Charles Bennett stepped forward from behind the podium at the front. His presence commanded the room instantly, the murmurs dying away. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his deep voice carrying easily. "This will be a formal proceeding. I ask that everyone maintain decorum as we review the final wishes of Gregory Whitmore." A soft click echoed as he opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents. He placed them deliberately on the podium, his hands steady, and glanced over the gathering. The tension was palpable, as if everyone were holding their breath for the first sentence. I clasped my hands together in my lap, forcing myself to focus on my breathing, on the rhythm of the second hand ticking from the clock behind Charles. Vanessa turned slightly in her chair, her eyes locking on me like a predator to prey. Her smile was small, deliberate. She leaned just enough so her words would slice through the silence pitched for me alone. "You're about to witness your own erasure." I felt the words graze against my resolve, testing for cracks, but instead of shrinking, I let the faintest hint of a smile tug at my mouth. My silence was deliberate, a choice I knew Vanessa would interpret as weakness. She turned back satisfied and straightened her blazer. Charles Bennett adjusted his glasses and reached for the folder that held the will. His eyes flicked up, scanning the room briefly, then settled on me for a heartbeat. There was a steadiness there, a quiet certainty that wrapped around me like armor. Charles opened the file containing the will, his gaze lingering on Claire with unshakable resolve. "To my granddaughter, Vanessa Whitmore." Charles Bennett's voice carried across the conference room like the opening bell of a coronation, and a ripple of hushed excitement traveled through the rows of attendees. The board members leaned forward slightly. The journalists stationed near the back scribbled notes. In the front row, Vanessa's chin lifted and a slow, deliberate smile curved her lips. I sat motionless near the back, watching her bask in the moment. She crossed one leg over the other, her perfectly pressed blazer catching the light like armor. Richard and Evelyn on either side of her exchanged a glance of quiet triumph, their expressions polished and expectant. I could almost feel the collective exhale of the room, the assumption that Gregory's legacy would continue exactly as the family's golden child believed it would. The primary residence of the Whitmore estate, valued at $8 million, Charles continued, his tone neutral and steady. Additionally, $2 million in liquid assets and the contents of the Aspen Villa shall be transferred to her name. Vanessa's smile widened, a gleam of satisfaction lighting her eyes. She tilted her head ever so slightly, glancing toward me with a kind of benevolent condescension, as if to say, "I told you so." Evelyn reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand under the table, and Richard nodded approvingly. I kept my gaze fixed on the portfolio in Charles's hands, my expression unreadable. My heartbeat was steady, anchored by the memory of Gregory's handwriting on the notes I'd studied last night, the plans he had left behind, the quiet trust he had placed in me. I felt Eleanor Chase's eyes on me from her seat at the board table. When I met her gaze, she arched a single brow, just enough to signal that she had noticed my composure. Vanessa, mistaking my stillness for defeat, leaned back in her chair and whispered to her mother, her voice a low hum of confidence. I waited until the applause had faded and Charles paused to turn the next page of the will. Then I leaned forward just enough for Vanessa to hear me, my voice barely above a whisper. "You might want to wait before celebrating," I murmured. Grandpa hated premature victories. The smile faltered just for a fraction of a second, and her eyes flicked toward me sharp with sudden irritation. "What are you talking about?" she hissed under her breath. I didn't answer. Instead, I shifted my gaze back to Charles as he cleared his throat and adjusted the stack of papers. Vanessa sat a little straighter, her hands tightening around the arms of her chair. Charles turned another page and looked up at the room. His voice was even, but the weight of the pause settled heavily over every pair of shoulders. And now, to Claire Whitmore. I leave controlling interest in Whitmore Holdings and the sum of $59 million to my granddaughter Claire Whitmore. The words dropped from Charles Bennet's lips like iron, silencing the room. The polished mahogany table might as well have turned to stone. No one moved. No one breathed. For a heartbeat, all I heard was the echo of my grandfather's voice from those afternoons at the cabin, teaching me to balance ledgers by the crackle of the fire. You need to understand what the numbers mean, Claire. They tell the truth, even when people don't. My hands rested quietly in my lap, fingers still, though my pulse roared in my ears. Vanessa's chair creaked as she jerked upright, her face blanching before color surged back in a flush of disbelief. What she demanded, the word cutting through the silence. That's impossible. Charles didn't flinch. He turned the page and continued in the same even tone. This includes 62% ownership of all corporate entities, voting authority on the board of directors, and full discretion regarding future leadership and asset allocation. All remaining personal and investment assets owned by Gregory Whitmore shall also be transferred to Claire Whitmore. A gasp rippled through the board members. Vanessa shook her head violently, her voice rising. No. She manipulated him. She's been planning this. I rose slowly from my seat, feeling every pair of eyes snap toward me. Grandpa made his choice. I said, my voice calm, steady. It was the same tone Gregory had used when others had tried to second-guess him. He knew exactly what he was doing. Vanessa surged to her feet, hands gripping the back of her chair. You never cared about this family, she shouted. You don't belong here. You never did. This is a trick. Richard slammed his palm onto the table, the crack of it reverberating around the room. We will contest this. Will. He barked, his face mottled with rage. Evelyn touched his arm, but her own expression was cold, calculating. Charles adjusted his glasses and spoke over the rising din. This document was prepared and executed under strict legal oversight. Gregory Whitmore underwent 2 independent evaluations confirming full mental capacity at the time of its signing. The will is clear and enforceable. That doesn't matter, Richard snapped. We'll find a way to tear it apart. We won't let Claire destroy this family's legacy. Eleanor Chase leaned forward slightly from her seat at the board table, her eyes narrowing on Richard before flicking to me. There was something in her gaze I hadn't seen before. Recognition, maybe even the beginnings of respect. Vanessa's breathing was shallow and sharp, like an animal cornered. You think you've won? She hissed at me, her voice low enough that only I could hear. I met her stare without blinking. Do what you must, I said, my tone unshaken as I turned my eyes briefly to my parents and back again. I'm ready. She manipulated Grandpa. She doesn't deserve a dime. The shout cracked across the conference room and set off a chain reaction, chairs, skidding voices, rising cameras, flashing in frantic bursts. Vanessa's face was a mask of fury, beautiful and terrible. Her hands clenched white on the back of her chair as if she might wrench the steel from its frame. Richard was already half standing, jaw flexing, while Evelyn's lips pressed into a pale line that trembled despite her control. I stayed on my feet because sitting felt like surrender. The room seemed to tilt and then steady again around the mahogany table where the will lay open like a lit match no one could snuff. In the din, I heard the memory of Gregory's porch, the stove ticking, the hush of wind through pines, and his quiet assurance that truth has a longer breath than lies. I curled that thought into my ribcage and let it hold me up. Mr. Bennet, Vanessa said, dragging her voice into a measured register that fooled no one, you will produce proof that my grandfather was competent when he signed. Medical evaluations, witness affidavits, immediately. She flicked her gaze toward the board. This circus compromises Whitmore Holdings. We cannot indulge fantasies. Charles Bennet did not flinch. He adjusted his glasses and lifted a second folder from the portfolio, with the same calm he might use to pour tea. "As you request," he said. Gregory Whitmore's final amendments were executed under rigorous protocol. 2 independent neurocognitive evaluations dated within weeks of signing concluded full decisional capacity. He passed copies to a paralegal who moved along the table distributing the documents like cool water in a heat wave. Murmurs rippled. Paper whispered. "That proves nothing about manipulation," Richard snapped. "A clever parasite doesn't need incapacity, only proximity." Eleanor Chase moved at last. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When she stood, conversation thinned to threads. "With respect," she said, "this board will remember itself." Gregory prized order, but he prized integrity more. "We will hear the rest, and we will conduct ourselves accordingly." Her eyes found mine, steady as a handrail, then slid back to Charles. "Proceed." Vanessa laughed, too bright, too sharp. "Integrity? Look at her." She jabbed a finger at me. "She lurked in the shadows for years and suddenly emerges with a crown. Convenient." I let the insult pass. To answer it would grant it shape. Instead, I drew a breath that tasted of paper dust and winter coats, and the metallic edge of fear, and I kept my spine straight. Across the front row, a few reporters angled their phones, hungry for a scene. I refused to feed them. Charles set the medical reports aside and placed a single envelope on the podium. It was thick cream, addressed in Gregory's slow, deliberate hand. "There is also this," he said. "A personal letter intended to be read to the family at the will reading should questions of intent arise." He broke the seal with a letter opener, unfolded the pages, and let the room quiet around him. Gregory's words entered the air like a weather front, cool and clarifying. He wrote about time freely given and time hoarded, about presence versus performance. He wrote of his pride in the company and his regret for the ways pride can curdle into spectacle. He spoke of me without ornament, how I had come when there was nothing to be photographed, how I had asked questions that were not designed to be quoted. He never begged the room to like me. He simply laid out the pattern he had watched and the choice he had made. Vanessa's mouth twisted. "He was sentimental," she said, but her voice had lost its center. "Sentiment should not run a corporation." "Nor should vanity," Eleanor replied so softly that several heads turned to be certain they had heard her. Richard rapped his knuckles on the table once, twice, as if he could knock the sense he wanted into the wood. "This is character testimony," he said. "Not governance, not law." "On the contrary," Charles said, glancing up from the letter. "Intent is the cornerstone of testamentary law." He looked back down and continued reading, his cadence unhurried. My throat tightened at a line about quiet loyalty outlasting applause. Evelyn shifted in her seat. A board member coughed. The room, for a strange, suspended moment, seemed to listen as one thing. Vanessa tried again, desperation slickening her tone. "She hovered around him at the end," she said. "She must have pressured him when he was vulnerable." "Dig deeper, there will be inconsistencies," Miss Whitmore, Charles said, and there was real sternness now, the kind that nailed shutters before a storm. "Your grandfather's directives were witnessed by 3 neutral parties and notarized. His counsel of record, myself, advised him at length. You may test the fences, but you will not find them rotten." A smattering of voices rose, board members conferring in undertones. The press, barred from this reading, would hear only what we allowed to escape. Still, the drama pressed at the glass, wanting out. I let the noise flow around me and fixed my gaze on the letter in Charles's hand, on the ink loops I knew as well as my own. By the stove, by the ledger, by the old map tacked over the desk, Gregory had shown me how to hold steady when the room refused to. I felt my shoulders drop an inch, as if a weight had recognized itself and finally slid into its socket. Eleanor's chair creaked as she straightened. "Let the letter finish," she said, and something in the way she said it, plain, absolute set the room. Charles turned to the final page. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't soften it. He read the last line as if placing a stone at the base of a marker where no one could miss it. Claire was the only one who showed up without a camera. Silence fell with the precision of snowfall. In that hush, even the HVAC seemed to hold its breath. I could feel the sentence settle against my skin, not as vindication exactly, but as recognition. Vanessa's face went slack, and then hard, a storm skidding over ice. Evelyn looked down, and for once her composure offered her no shelter. Richard's eyes flicked to the door, calculating exits. The boardroom shifted on its axis. The accusations that had flown so easily only minutes ago now ricocheted back at their senders, stripped of momentum. Not everyone was on my side. Power never turns all at once, but the angle had changed. When I looked toward the table, I caught the briefest flick of Eleanor's chin stand, and I did. Not to speak, not to gloat, just to be visible in the place they had sworn I did not belong. Vanessa recovered first. "This is theater," she said, but the brittle edge betrayed her. "We will petition to seal this and pursue injunctions." "You cannot," Vanessa. Richard warned under his breath the single word. "A leash." Charles closed the folder. "The legal notices will go out this afternoon," he said. "In the interim, I advise all parties to refrain from public statements. As executor, I will enforce Gregory's wishes to the letter." He looked to the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you will respect the decedent's intent." A chair scraped beside me. I turned. A board member I recognized by face but not by name, mid-50s, careful suit. The calm of a man who prefers to count before he speaks had risen. He didn't address the room. He stepped into my aisle with a deliberateness that drew no attention and came to stand at my shoulder close enough that I could see the silver thread at his cuff. His voice, when it came, was for me alone, pitched beneath the room's renewed chatter meant to slide under the noise and lodge where decisions are made. "Miss Whitmore, we need to discuss the company's future in private." "I will not let her take everything." Vanessa's voice ricocheted down the marbled hallway like a whip, sending the junior associates scattering. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom had barely closed behind us when she spun her heels, clicking sharply against the polished floor. Her face was a mask of fury, flawless makeup barely hiding the raw red bloom across her cheeks. I stood a few steps away with Charles Bennett at my side, trying to steady the thrum of my pulse. Gregory's words whispered at the edge of my thoughts. "Strength isn't in shouting louder, Claire. It's in standing firm." I took a slow breath and planted my feet. Vanessa stalked toward Charles, stabbing a manicured finger at his chest. "I want to see every page, every note, every signature from that so-called will. There has to be a crack somewhere. You're hiding something." Charles didn't even blink. "Miss Whitmore, as executor, I have already disclosed what is required by law. The will was executed properly, witnessed, and notarized. There is no flaw to exploit." Richard closed the distance behind his daughter, his shoulders squared, voice low and dangerous. "Then we'll drag this into court and make one. I have attorneys who can tie this up for years, Bennett. You know how quickly the market turns on uncertainty. That company will bleed under Claire's so-called leadership. Threats won't change the facts." Charles replied, his voice even. Evelyn stepped forward, clasping her hands in front of her as though she were about to offer a prayer. Her tone was deceptively calm. "Claire, you don't want this to become uglier than it already is. If you step aside quietly, we might be willing to discuss a settlement." I met her gaze. "I'm not stepping aside." Vanessa's laugh was brittle, a shard of glass. "You think this is over because you stood in a room and listened to a letter. You have no allies, Claire. You'll fail. Everyone knows you're unprepared." Eleanor Chase appeared then, emerging from a quiet corner near the elevators. She stepped between us with the deliberate grace of someone who commanded attention without raising her voice. "Enough," she said, and the single word carried more weight than all of Vanessa's shouting. Vanessa bristled. "You're siding with her. I'm siding with the company," Eleanor said coolly. She turned to me, her voice softer. Claire, don't rise to this. Let them waste their energy. You need to keep yours. Charles placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, a silent vote of confidence. Vanessa's glare burned through me, but I didn't flinch. I simply met her eyes. Get used to disappointment, I said quietly. Richard muttered something under his breath, but Charles was already ushering me toward the elevator. This is over for today, he told the others. As we reached the doors, I felt a gentle tug at my sleeve. Eleanor leaned close enough that only I could hear. Meet me tomorrow morning, she whispered. We can't waste time. You're stepping into a war zone. Do you even know who's loyal to you? Eleanor's whisper landed like a warning bell as the elevator doors opened to the executive level of Whitmore Holdings. My grip tightened on the leather folder tucked beneath my arm, the one holding Gregory's carefully written business plan. I'd studied the pages until I could recite them in my sleep, memorizing every projection, every contingency. Never walk into a room blind, Gregory had told me once. The boardroom was already filling when Eleanor and I entered. Members sat in clusters that reflected their alliances. Some nodded politely, others barely acknowledged me. At the far end of the table, a few exchanged low words with the quiet confidence of those who believed they were in control. Let's begin, Eleanor said, her voice firm as she took her seat at the head of the table. We're here to discuss the future of Whitmore Holdings in light of Gregory Whitmore's passing and the execution of his will. Almost immediately, one of Vanessa's loyalists, a man named Harrington with a perpetual frown, leaned forward. With all due respect, Ms. Whitmore, you lack the experience necessary to lead a corporation of this size. Gregory's decision was unconventional. We must act responsibly to safeguard our interests. I agree, another chimed in. A vote of no confidence would allow us to install stable leadership. Vanessa is ready and capable. I held their gazes one by one, letting the silence stretch before I spoke. You're right, I said evenly. I don't have Vanessa's flair for publicity or her appetite for spectacle. But I do have this. I placed the folder on the table and opened it. Gregory left a comprehensive business plan covering operations, market expansion, and financial projections for the next 5 years. He didn't want a figurehead. He wanted a leader who would honor his work. Some members shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor's eyes flicked to me with a subtle nod of encouragement. Harrington scoffed. Plans on paper mean nothing if you can't execute them. I met his stare. Then watch me. But understand this. If you sabotage this company because you think Vanessa will rescue it, you're betraying Gregory Whitmore's legacy, and the shareholders will hold you accountable. The words struck their mark. Several members glanced at each other, their expressions betraying doubt. Gregory's name still carried weight in this room, more than Vanessa's charisma ever could. Eleanor interjected smoothly, "We'll review the plan in detail. Until then, I expect professionalism from all of you. This company cannot afford division." Chairs scraped as the meeting adjourned. Some avoided my eye as they filed out. Others gave curt nods, their minds clearly working through the implications. Near the doorway, one of Vanessa's staunchest allies pulled out his phone, typing furiously. The screen lit briefly with a message before he slipped it into his jacket pocket. "She's stronger than we thought. This isn't over yet." The wine glass shattered against the marble hearth, crimson spilling across the pale rug like a warning. Vanessa stood rigid in the dim light of the Whitmore estate's living room, her chest rising and falling as though she might combust from sheer rage. Richard watched from his leather chair, hands clasped in front of him, while Evelyn silently reached for a napkin to blot the wine droplets from her sleeve. "Calm yourself," Richard said finally. "Rage won't win this." "I am calm," Vanessa snapped, though her clenched jaw said otherwise. "Claire has the board eating out of her hand. Eleanor Chase is bolstering her credibility. If we don't strike back, she'll cement herself before we can act." Evelyn placed the blood-stained napkin carefully on the tray beside her. "Then we strike at her image. Claire has no allies in the press. One whisper in the right ear, and the board will start to question their faith in her. If the company looks unstable, she will lose ground before she even begins. Vanessa's expression hardened. I'll make the call tonight. And in the meantime, I want our attorneys prepared to challenge every clause of that will. Claire can't hold what doesn't belong to her. Richard nodded, already pulling out his phone. I'll connect you with Carmichael. He relishes cases like this. Hours later, in the small apartment I'd retreated to after another grueling day, I sat at my kitchen table, Gregory's wooden box beside me. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room as I scrolled through documents on my laptop. My phone chimed with a new email. You think you've won? Watch the news tomorrow. The message was unsigned, a single line with no subject and no traceable sender. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. Gregory's voice echoed in my mind. They'll expose themselves if you stay calm. I forwarded the message to Charles Bennett with a short note, then called Eleanor Chase. They're planning something, I said. It's coming tomorrow. We'll be ready, Eleanor assured me. Hold your ground, Claire. They want you rattled. Meanwhile, across town, Vanessa was already dialing a familiar number. I have a story about Claire Whitmore, she told the journalist who answered. It will make headlines by morning. I switched on the television just as the evening anchor teased a breaking story for the next day. My breath caught as the words Claire Whitmore flashed across the ticker at the bottom of the screen. Claire turned up the volume, watching the early leak about a scandal set to explode. Scandal hits Whitmore Holdings heiress accused of fraud. The morning headline blared from every screen in the Whitmore Holdings communications hub, the anchor's grave voice narrating the damage as if it were a foregone conclusion. Stock tickers crawled red across the monitors. The newsroom buzz of phones and keyboards felt suffocating, a cacophony of panic. I stood in the center of it all, Gregory's words from his last letter echoing in my mind. The truth will outlast any lie. The PR director, a harried man named Lawson, approached with a stack of printed headlines. We've issued a holding statement, but it's not enough. The market opened down 7% and shareholders are calling non-stop. We need a stronger response. Before I could answer, several board members filed into the room, their faces tense. Harrington, who had always favored Vanessa, spoke first. Claire, for the good of the company, we urge you to step aside temporarily. These allegations, whether true or not, are undermining investor confidence. We need stability. Step aside, I repeated, my voice flat. It's only until the investigation clears your name, another member added quickly. If you resign voluntarily, the board can install an interim CEO. Vanessa is willing. Of course she is. Eleanor Chase cut in sharply, folding her arms. And if you force Claire out, you'll hand Whitmore Holdings to the very person orchestrating this circus. The room went quiet for a beat, and that's when Charles Bennett entered, his expression grim but controlled. He carried a slim black folder and crossed the floor to stand beside me. We've traced the source of the leak, he said, holding the folder up for the board to see. The evidence is clear. Vanessa Whitmore hired a private media firm to fabricate documents and feed the story to national outlets. I opened the folder and scanned the pages: emails, invoices, signed contracts. My pulse steadied with every line I read. When I looked up, my voice was strong. I will not step down. And I will prove these allegations are fabricated. Harrington bristled. Claire, this isn't about pride. It's about the company. It's about the truth. I said, cutting him off. And if you can't see that you're failing the legacy Gregory built. This company cannot be run by someone who lies to destroy her own family. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, faint but growing. Eleanor stepped closer to me, her presence a quiet shield. What's your plan? She asked softly. I turned to face the board, the PR team, everyone in the room. We will hold a special board meeting and a press conference on December 21st, I said. We'll lay out the evidence and clear this company's name. Vanessa and anyone complicit in this attack will be exposed. Lawson hesitated. That's a week away. The market. The market will survive, I said. But if we act rashly, if we cave now, we won't. There was no applause, no grand show of support. But as I gathered the folder and turned toward the door, I caught the flicker of resolve on Eleanor's face. Charles followed me out, the weight of the week ahead settling on my shoulders like armor rather than a burden. Claire decided to call an emergency meeting with the board and the press on December 21st to expose the truth. The main hall of Whitmore Holdings was packed with journalists, shareholders, and the full company board as I stepped up to the podium with Eleanor at my side. The air was thick with anticipation, the click of camera shutters and the low murmur of voices fading into silence as the microphones caught the first sound of my footsteps. I tightened my grip on the edge of the podium and let my gaze sweep the crowd, anchoring myself in the memory of Gregory's handwritten words. "They'll tell you that you don't deserve it. I'm choosing to remember you." I cleared my throat. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," I began, my voice carrying across the room. "In the past week, Whitmore Holdings has been the subject of serious allegations. Today, we will present the truth." A large screen behind me came alive with documents, invoices, and email chains, the evidence Charles Bennett had so painstakingly uncovered. These are the records that show Vanessa Whitmore hired a private firm to manufacture fraudulent documents and distribute them to the press. I said, my tone unflinching. This was not an accident. It was a coordinated attack meant to destabilize this company and undermine the final wishes of Gregory Whitmore. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Vanessa, seated in the front row with Richard and Evelyn, went pale, then flushed with anger. She half rose from her chair, but Eleanor stepped forward, her voice firm. "You will remain seated, Miss Whitmore. The evidence speaks for itself." I turned back to the crowd. "We have also traced payments from Vanessa's personal accounts to third-party intermediaries. These payments coincided directly with the publication of these fabricated allegations. Shareholders, board members, you deserve to see the truth." The room was utterly still as the evidence looped across the screen. Richard stared at the floor, his hands clasped tightly, while Evelyn's expression was frozen, unreadable. Neither of them moved to defend their daughter. Charles Bennett stepped up to the microphone. "The board will now vote on whether to remove Vanessa Whitmore from any official role within Whitmore Holdings," he said. Ballots were distributed, collected, and counted in a silence broken only by the rustle of paper. When Charles announced the result, the words struck like a gavel. "The motion passes. Vanessa Whitmore is removed from any and all positions effective immediately. Claire Whitmore is hereby confirmed as CEO." Vanessa shot to her feet, her hands balled into fists. "This is a farce," she shouted. "You've all been manipulated." I stepped down from the podium and walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate. When we stood eye to eye, I spoke just loudly enough for the microphones to catch it. "You wanted to humiliate me in public," I said coldly. "Now you know how it feels." Vanessa recoiled, her lips trembling as security quietly approached to escort her from the hall. Richard and Evelyn followed, their silence an indictment of its own. The cameras flashed again as I returned to the podium to close the meeting. "Whitmore Holdings will move forward with integrity," I said. "We will honor Gregory Whitmore's legacy, not tear it apart for personal gain. Thank you." That evening, I drove alone through the snowy back roads to Gregory's cabin. The familiar scent of pine and cold air hit me as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust floated in the light of the setting sun, but the place felt untouched, as though Gregory might walk in at any moment. I sat by the fire pit with the wooden box in my lap, its hinges creaking softly as I opened it. Inside lay Gregory's worn leather journal. I flipped to the final entry, his careful handwriting filling the page. "I know Claire will find her way. She doesn't need my voice to guide her anymore. She's strong enough to guide herself." Tears blurred the ink, but I smiled through them, the warmth of his faith settling deep in my chest. For the first time in years, I felt steady, steady enough to lead, steady enough to simply be. The dust finally settled, and the empire that once seemed untouchable now stood in Claire's hands, restored to the integrity her grandfather had envisioned. The lesson was clear: when injustice is met with quiet courage and persistence, even the most powerful lies will crumble under the weight of truth. Like the final toll of a bell after a storm, justice may arrive late, but it resonates long and loud. Perhaps standing up today means you'll never again have to bow to injustice tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you felt connected, or 2 if you think it could have